to reconstruct Middle Chinese and Old Chinese with Latin alphabet, not IPA. Important modern Chinese linguists include Y.R. Chao, Luo Chongbei, Li Fengyi, and Wang Li. The ancient commentators on the classics paid much attention to syntax and the use of particles, but the first Chinese grammar, in the modern sense of the word, was produced by Ma Jianzhong, late 19th century. His grammar was based on the Latin prescriptive model Middle Agas Arabic grammar. Due to the rapid expansion of Islam in the 8th century, many people learned Arabic as a lingua franca. For this reason, the earliest grammatical treatises on Arabic are often written by non-native speakers. The earliest grammarian who is known to us is Abdallah ibn Abi Ishaq al-Hadrami, died 735–736 CE, 117 AH. The efforts of 3 generations of grammarians culminated in the book of the Persian linguist Sibawayh, c. 760–793, Sibawayh made a detailed and professional description of Arabic in 760 in his monumental work, Al-Kitab fi al-Nahw, Al-Kitab fi al-Nahw, the book on grammar. In his book he distinguished phonetics from phonology, European vernaculars. The Irish Sana's Cormac's glossary is Europe's first etymological and encyclopedic dictionary. In any non-classical language, the Modestae or speculative grammarians in the 13th century introduced the notion of universal grammar. In De Vulgari Eloquentia, on the eloquence of vernacular, Dante expanded the scope of linguistic enquiry from Latin, Greek to include the languages of the day. Other linguistic works of the same period concerning the vernaculars include the first grammatical treatise, Icelandic, or the Orisep na Neches, Irish. The Renaissance and Baroque period saw an intensified interest in linguistics, notably for the purpose of Bible translations by the Jesuits, and also related to philosophical speculation on philosophical languages and the origin of language. Modern linguistics did not begin until the late 18th century, and the Romantic or Animist theses of Johann Gottfried Herder and Johann Christoph Adling remained influential well into the 19th century. Historical linguistics during the 18th century, conjectural history, based on a mix of linguistics and anthropology, on the topic of both the origin and progress of language and society, was fashionable. These thinkers contributed to the construction of academic paradigms, in which some languages were labeled primitive relative to the English language. Within this paradigm, a primitive people could be discerned by their primitive language, as in the case of Hugh Blair, who argued that Native Americans gesticulated wildly to compensate for poor lexicon of their primitive language. Around the same time, James Burnett authored a 6-volume treatise that delved more deeply into the matter of savage languages. Other writers theorized that Native American languages were nothing but the natural and instinctive cries of the animal, without grammatical structure. The thinkers within this paradigm connected themselves with the Greeks and Romans, viewed as the only civilized persons of the ancient world, a view articulated by Thomas Sheridan, who compiled an important 18th century pronunciation dictionary. It was to the care taken in the cultivation of their languages that Greece and Rome owed that splendor which eclipsed all the other nations of the world in the 18th century. James Burnett, Lord Monboddo, analyzed numerous languages and deduced logical elements of the evolution of human language. His thinking was interleaved with his precursive concepts of biological evolution. Some of his early concepts have been validated and are considered correct today. In his The Sanskrit Language, 1786, Sir William Jones proposed that Sanskrit and Persian had resemblances to classical Greek, Latin, Gothic, and Celtic languages. From this idea sprung the field of comparative linguistics and historical linguistics. Through the 19th century, European linguistics centered on the comparative history of the Indo-European languages, with a concern for finding their common roots and tracing their development. In the 1820s, Wilhelm von Humboldt observed that human language was a rule-governed system, anticipating a theme that was to become central in the formal work on syntax and semantics of language in the 20th century. Of this observation he said, said that it allowed language to make infinite use of finite means, uber den dualis. 1827. Humboldt's work is associated with the movement of Romantic linguistics, which was inspired by nature philosophy and Romantic science. Other notable representatives of the movement include Carl Wilhelm Friedrich Schlegel and Franz Bopp. It was only in the late 19th century that the neo-grammarian approach of Karl Brugmann and others introduced a rigid notion of sound law. Historical linguistics also led to the emergence of the semantics and some forms of pragmatics. Nerlich, 1992, Nerlich and Clark, 1996. Structuralism in Europe. There was a development of structural linguistics, initiated by Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss professor of Indo-European and General Linguistics, whose lectures on general linguistics, published posthumously by his students, set the direction of European linguistic analysis from the 1920s on. His approach has been widely adopted in other fields under the broad term structuralism. Descriptive linguistics. During the Second World War, North American linguists Leonard Bloomfield, William Mandeville Austin and several of his students and colleagues developed teaching materials for a variety of languages whose knowledge was needed for the war effort. This work led to an increasing prominence of the field of linguistics, which became a recognized discipline in most American universities. Only after the war, in 1965, William Stokoe, the linguist from Gallaudet University, published an analysis which proved that American Sign Language fits the criteria for a natural language. Generative linguistics. Other subfields from roughly 1980 onwards, pragmatic, functional, and cognitive approaches have steadily gained ground, both in the United States and in Europe. Generative grammar. Generative grammar is a linguistic theory that regards grammar as a system of rules that generates exactly those combinations of words that form grammatical sentences in a given language. Noam Chomsky first used the term in relation to the theoretical linguistics of grammar that he developed in the late 1950s. Linguists who follow the generative approach have been called generativists. The generative school has focused on the study of syntax and addressed other aspects of a language's structure, including morphology and phonology. Early versions of Chomsky's theory were called transformational grammar, a term still used to include his subsequent theories, the most recent of which is the minimalist program theory. Chomsky and other generativists have argued that many of the properties of a generative grammar arise from a universal grammar that is innate to the human brain, rather than being learned from the environment. See the poverty of the stimulus argument. There are a number of versions of generative grammar currently practiced within linguistics. A contrasting approach is that of constraint-based grammars, where generative grammar attempts to list all the rules that result in all well-formed sentences. Constraint-based grammars allow anything that is not otherwise constrained. Certain versions of dependency grammar, head-driven phrase structure grammar, lexical, functional grammar, categorical grammar, relational grammar, link grammar, and tree-adjoining grammar are constraint-based grammars that have been proposed. In stochastic grammar, grammatical correctness is taken as a probabilistic variable, rather than a discrete yes or no property. Frameworks. There are a number of different approaches to generative grammar. Common to all is the effort to come up with a set of rules or principles that formally defines each and every one of the members of the set of well-formed expressions of a natural language. The term generative grammar has been associated with at least the following schools of linguistics: transformational grammar, TG, standard theory, street, extended standard theory, EST, revised extended standard theory, REST principles, and parameters theory, P&P, government and binding theory, GB, minimalist program, MP, monostratal or non-transformational grammars, relational grammar, RG, lexical functional grammar, LFG, generalized phrase structure grammar, GPSG, head-driven phrase structure grammar, HPSG, categorical grammar, tree-adjoining grammar. Historical development of models of transformational grammar. Although Leonard Bloomfield, whose work Chomsky rejects, saw the ancient Indian Indian grammarian Panini as an antecedent of structuralism. Chomsky, in an award acceptance speech delivered in India in 2001, claimed the first generative grammar in the modern sense was Panini's grammar. Generative grammar has been under development since the late 1950s and has undergone many changes in the types of rules and representations that are used to predict grammaticality. In tracing the historical development of ideas within generative grammar, it is useful to refer to various stages in the development of the theory. Standard theory, 1957 to 1965, the so-called standard theory,